Hello, and thank you for joining this presentation. My name is Dorota Lee, and I work in the data assurance at the Office for Students. We are responsible for conducting data audits and also the annual ILR verifications. This presentation covers the following areas. Our first definition of higher education data, how we use the LARS database, what is a collaborative provision and how that should be returned in the ILR, OFS's expectations for your data management and the oversight, what we look out for in our audits, and I will also try to give you some examples of good practice in this area. I hope that these slides and my presentation will be helpful, but I'd like to point out that it is not intended to replace the official guidance, and you will also need to refer to the ILR specification and support manual as you usually would when preparing your return. You will also see that the guidance on many fields in the ILR specification refers to the HESA guidance. I would encourage you to refer to it for those fields, as that guidance will often provide additional information and also some helpful examples. I am now going to talk through our definition of higher education and how we use the learning aim search. For our purposes, higher education is any activity at level 4 or above, and we use the fields indicated on the slide in the learning aim search to identify this provision. Recognized higher education for funding purposes is a subset of this. It includes courses that are designated under 2011 regulations, other than those leading to a qualification in the Register of Regulated Qualifications. Credit can be included as a recognised higher education if it meets the conditions in the HESA's guidance. We use the learning aim search to identify and classify higher education. To do this, we use the fields listed on the slide. It is important that courses are included in LARS database and that the data in that database is accurate. We would encourage you to apply for learning aim as early as you can when a course is set up, and also we would encourage you to periodically check that the data on the LARS for the courses you provide is accurate. Now I'm going to talk briefly about collaborative provision. Many colleges are involved in subcontractual relationships, whether that's delivering teaching for students registered at another provider, known as subcontracting in, or subcontracting out provisions so that students registered with your provider are taught by another. Students that are subcontracted out should be returned in ILR as your students. The provider teaching them should not be returning them. Fields Partner UK PRN and PCOLAB should be completed to show the partner delivering teaching and the proportion of the aim delivered by them. Students that are subcontracted in should not be included in the ILR. Instead, this would be returned in the HESA return or the ILR by the provider registering the students. We often find significant issues with data quality where provision is contracted out. In particular, we find that providers are unable to explain why field values have been returned in some cases, or are unable to provide evidence that is needed to determine accurate field values. Responsibility for data quality lies with the provider returning students in the same way as if the students were taught by the provider. This means that if you are subcontracting out provision, we would expect that the processes are in place to ensure that data is accurate. We consider it good practice for the processes to collect and maintain data for subcontracted provision to be set out in a partnership agreement. This is so that the expectations are clear for both organizations. It is also good practice to have arrangements for oversight in place so that the provider returning the data can have confidence that data and information received from the teaching partner is reliable. Often we find that there hasn't been clear understanding of the difference between a validation arrangement and a subcontractual arrangement. When you are teaching awards that are validated by other institutions, please remember that those are still your students. It is the course that is being validated, so you should be returning the students in your own ILR. Now we'll move to systems and processes. Expectations for data. Our regulatory framework states how the OFS intends to perform its various functions. It includes two conditions which are of particular relevance to the provision of student data. Condition F3 requires providers to provide data and also permits the OFS to verify it. F3 requires providers to cooperate with monitoring or investigations carried out by OFS. When the OFS assesses compliance with condition F3, the quality, reliability and timeliness of information provided will be considered. I would also like to draw your attention to condition E2, which requires providers to have adequate management and governance arrangements in place to comply with all conditions of registration, including F3. This condition means that compliance with E2 may be assessed if we find any issues with compliance with condition F3, and conversely, if there are condition F3 concerns about the data quality, a provider may also be assessed for the condition E2. We do have some expectations regarding how providers will manage and oversee the higher education data returns, and that's what I'll be talking about next. In summary, our expectations are set out on this slide, and I'm going to talk through each of these points in turn. This slide may seem quite obvious, but we would expect that systems and processes are designed well so that they do deliver accurate data. In practice, it means that you need to have an understanding of the field definitions and what's required. You'll need to also have a suitable student record system or an alternative system in place to capture and manage student data. Processes for application, enrollment and managing data throughout the student lifecycle will need to be designed to gather adequate information, including recording that supporting evidence was seen when necessary. Validation warnings and checks should be used where possible to avoid errors, and that is particularly important where data is input manually. We would expect that staff involved in managing student data have sufficient training and support. The person responsible for collating the ILR data needs to have good knowledge of the requirements and needs to be aware of any changes year on year. If resourcing at your provider allows, then having a second person with knowledge of the requirements who can check the data can be really helpful in improving the data quality, but we do appreciate that it's not always possible. Whenever other staff are involved in collecting, inputting and maintaining data, such as staff responsible for admissions and enrollment, it's really helpful for them to have guidance and training. For example, if you are relying on staff responsible for enrollment to check fields such as names and date of birth against students' identification, it is helpful to ensure that they know the purpose of the reviewing identification and what they are required to check. For example, do they need to check any middle names or matching identification on your system? We often see that data quality is improved when steps are taken to ensure that staff involved in the management of data understand the possible consequences of data error. As mentioned earlier, it may not always be possible for providers to have more than one individual able to collate and return ILR data. Therefore, written documentation can reduce the risks associated with over-reliance on one member of staff. This can also help to ensure that key steps in the processes, including checks, are not missed. Documentation can also be a really useful tool in ensuring that the lessons from previous years' returns have been learned. Where provider needs students to provide documentary evidence, then it can be really helpful to provide training and written guidance to staff reviewing the evidence. This is to ensure that checks of documentation are consistent and always conducted. We would also expect that providers can evidence that checks have taken place. This can be as simple as requiring the staff member responsible for checking documentation to tick a box or sign a form to confirm that they have carried them out. We don't require providers to keep copies of documentary evidence, such as personal identification or certificates of qualification. But when providers do choose to do that, these documents can be used to double-check field values later on, which can improve data quality. In all cases, we expect that providers maintain evidence of field values for 5 years from submission of data. And just to note that this means the records need to be kept for 5 years after the student is last returned in the ILR for the course. We often find through audits that providers determine many fields at enrolment and that these are not always reviewed as students progress. These are fields where we would expect the values to be reviewed each year, such as the fields which capture the type of term time accommodation, which clearly may change as the student goes through their course. Re-enrollment process should enable these fields to be updated as required. We would also consider it good practice to use re-enrollment as an opportunity to recheck and amend as necessary other key fields. We expect that providers are able to evidence that continuing students have returned to study. This may be achieved through requiring continuing students to re-enroll in person or through monitoring attendance through the registers. Data quality can be improved with effective checks, and ideally it's helpful to have someone who is not involved in compiling the return to do this. However, checks are only likely to be effective if the person conducting them has sufficient knowledge of the requirements. As I've already mentioned, validation can help avoid errors. Checks beyond validation should be aimed at identifying data that is likely to be incorrect. For example, through looking for combinations of field values that are unlikely and may indicate errors. The annual ILR verification process is aimed at supporting providers in checking ILR data before the final submission. We conduct a variety of checks on the data which are aimed at identifying errors or that appear not credible so that you can conduct additional checks. This process is most effective where providers submit full returns to us early enough in the process to allow time for providers to consider our queries, check data, and make corrections as required. We strongly encourage providers to engage with the process fully each year. Finally, we would expect that the effectiveness of processes would be evaluated periodically. The quality of returned data is important, and so we would expect that providers will, from time to time, consider whether the processes to compile and manage data remain appropriate. Wherever errors in data are identified, either by the provider or by ourselves, we would expect that processes are reviewed to avoid errors reoccurring. Our data audits will usually involve testing the accuracy of data, including through reviewing the evidence for field values maintained by providers. If we find data errors through audits, we will expect the providers to revise the processes to avoid errors recurring. Finally, I'm going to talk a little about our expectations for oversight of data providers. Given the importance of data quality, we expect senior management and governors to have sufficient oversight to gain assurance. How this is approached will vary between providers, and this slide lists some of the approaches we have seen throughout our work in the sector. We frequently see some level of reporting to senior management about the processes to collate and return student data, and we would expect to see exceptional reporting where major issues with the collection or returning of data are identified. We also often see internal audit or external reviews of data quality or data processes. This can be really helpful in providing assurance to senior management that the processes in place are adequate. Providers are expected to have means to identify issues or weaknesses with their own systems and processes and take actions to address them. This is something we look for when we conduct a data audit at the provider. We explore who's responsible for compiling returns and also who has oversight of the relevant processes. We will explore how senior managers and governors gain assurance that data returned is accurate. We will usually consider if sign-off processes are appropriate. And then finally, if we do identify any data errors throughout audit, we would expect that the governing body will oversee that corrective actions are implemented and lessons learned for the future returns. Hope you found this presentation helpful. Thank you for listening.